There is an exact moment when self-knowledge stops liberating you and begins to imprison you. And most people never realize when they cross that line. You started the journey with the best of intentions, you wanted to understand yourself, you wanted to heal, you wanted to become a more conscious version of who you are. And for a while, it worked. But at some point along the way, without you noticing, healing turned into a habit of suffering. Introspection turned into rumination. And the inner dive that was supposed to bring you back to the surface kept you at the bottom instead. If you have ever caught yourself revisiting the same wounds for months or years, telling the same stories, feeling the same pain, and still not moving forward, this video exists to tell you something that perhaps no one has said to you yet. You have already learned what you needed to learn here. Now it is time to turn the page, and turning the page is not running away. It is the most courageous and most mature act that exists in the entire healing process. The first thing we need to name honestly is the paradox of self-knowledge. It is one of the most powerful tools a human being can develop, but like every powerful tool, it can cause damage when misused. Psychologist Tasha Eurich, a self-awareness researcher at the University of Colorado, spent years studying how people know themselves, and arrived at a conclusion that should be part of every personal development course. There is a fundamental difference between healthy introspection and destructive rumination. Healthy introspection asks you questions that move you forward, rumination asks you questions that go in circles. And the difference between the two is not in the depth, it is in the direction. When looking inward becomes the center of your existence instead of a tool in service of your life, you stop living. You begin to exist inside your own analysis. And that is when the healing process becomes a comfortable prison, because it is familiar, because it is known, because pain, as strange as it may seem, gives a sense of identity that the unknown of the new cannot yet offer. Think for a moment about someone you know, or perhaps about yourself, who spends years in therapy, reading self-help books, taking personal development courses, and still remains stuck in the same patterns, attracting the same situations, repeating the same complaints. Not because therapy doesn't work. Not because knowledge is useless. But because at some point the knowledge stopped turning into action. Stopped turning into life. Stopped transforming into choice. And became, simply, a very well-articulated theory about why life is still not working. Self-knowledge is the map. But a map is not a journey. And walking sometimes requires folding the map, putting it in your pocket, and trusting that you already know enough to take the next step, even without having all the answers. Here is the psychological mechanism behind this that neuroscience helps explain. When you go through a painful experience, your brain creates a narrative about the event to make sense of the suffering. That narrative becomes part of your identity. And identity, from a neurological standpoint, is one of the most resistant systems to change that exists, because the brain treats any threat to identity the same way it treats a physical threat. With resistance, with fear, with rejection. So when you begin to consider the possibility of releasing the narrative of pain, a part of your nervous system interprets that as danger, as loss. As if healing were, in some way, a betrayal of who you were. But the truth that part of the brain cannot process is that you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to do with what happened to you. And there is an enormous distance between those two statements. One keeps you trapped in the past, and the other gives you back the authorship of your own story. So how do you know when it is time to turn the page? There is a specific signal, and it is simpler than you might imagine. When you notice that you are going in circles, talking about the same things, feeling the same pain, attracting the same situations, that is the signal. Not that you failed in the healing process, but that you have already extracted what you needed to extract from that cycle. It is the moment when continuing to dig will not find more gold, because the gold has already been found. Now it is time to rise to the surface. And the mind attached to the process will raise every objection. What if I'm not ready yet? What if I forget? What if I'm running away? Those questions seem prudent. But most of the time they are protection mechanisms of a nervous system that confuses familiarity with safety. You are not running away when you decide to move forward. You are maturing. Turning the page has a practical structure, and it does not begin with a grand decision. It begins with an honest recognition. The first movement is what contemplative traditions call integration, and what contemporary psychology confirms as the final stage of any genuine healing process. To integrate is not to forget. It is not to pretend it never happened. It is to look at everything you have lived through and say with awareness, this is also part of me, yes, but it no longer defines me. When you integrate an experience, the memory loses its weight. It does not disappear, it changes its function. It stops being a wound that bleeds every time it is touched and becomes wisdom that guides without paralyzing. Pain transforms into power. The healed wound becomes strength. And the tear that was truly lived through, not necessarily explained, but genuinely crossed, becomes compassion for yourself and for others. The second movement is what few people talk about because it seems too simple: beginning to act differently before you feel differently. Most people wait for emotional healing to precede behavioral change. They wait to feel ready before acting as if they were. But the neuroscience of behavioral change points consistently in the opposite direction. Action precedes feeling. When you begin to respond differently to situations that used to activate you, when you make the choices that the healed version of you would make, even without fully feeling that you have arrived there, the brain begins to update its identity narrative. Not because you pretended, but because you gave your nervous system new evidence of who you are becoming. And new evidence creates new experiences. And new experiences create the feeling you were waiting for before you could begin. There is also a silent guilt that appears when we decide to move forward, as if advancing were a disrespect to the pain you lived through, or as if being well were somehow a betrayal of the version of you that suffered. That guilt needs to be named because it is one of the most subtle and most paralyzing obstacles in the entire process. Moving forward is not erasing the past, it is honoring what was and choosing to live what comes. It is looking at who you were and saying with deep gratitude, you survived until here. Now let me continue. That is a profoundly spiritual gesture, because it is the moment you recognize that your story shaped you, but no longer defines you. You say goodbye to the pain not because it did not matter, but because it has already fulfilled what it had to teach you. When something deep inside recognizes a truth before you can even articulate it, that is not coincidence. That is clarity. It is the wisest part of you signaling that the cycle is complete and that there is life waiting on the other side of that choice. Remember this: self-knowledge was made to be a bridge, not a home. The past was made to teach you, not to house you. And pain was made to transform you, not to define you. True healing does not happen when you finally understand everything, it happens when you decide to return to life with everything you have learned. So stop for a moment, place your hand on your chest. Feel what is ready to be released, and feel what begins to come in its place. If this video touched something you had not yet been able to name, send it to someone who also needs to hear this. Because sometimes the greatest kindness you can offer someone is to show them that there is a way out. Subscribe to continue here. The next video brings something that closes this cycle completely. How to begin again without having to destroy yourself first. See you there.